Well, iLead listeners, wow, I am so excited to have Dr. Angelique Chaison with us on today. Now, let me just tell you a snippet. If I took everything that I can tell you guys about her, all of our time would be gone. So I can't do that. So this, let me tell you that for our guests to talk about leadership today and emotional intelligence and all of those kinds of pieces. Let me just tell you before I get in, you're going to learn what it means to really know yourself emotionally, and then how to bring that to bear in your leadership responsibilities. That's one of the focus that we're going to have. But then we're going to do a lot of broad conversation as well. It's always going to be seen through the lens of leadership. You already know that's how we roll. iLead listeners, let me just tell you, Dean's Distinguished Graduate, Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, University highest honor, summa cum laude. I was thank you, Lord. Cum laude. What can we say but Lordy? Outstanding Educational Consultant Award for DEI at Baylor College of Medicine, Commitment to Diversity Award, Outstanding Contribution. Those are just her awards. Now, let me just tell you about her education. She, UT, the famed UT. Okay, that's enough right there. That's a mouthful right there. Got a BA from UT, got a master's in educational psychology from UT, and her PhD in counseling psychology. Boom, boom, boom. Just in a few short years, she just went through all of that. Her area, though, with respect to leadership, is emotional intelligence, soft skills in another world that we would say. How do we look at that? How do we manage that? And that's what we want to talk about. And I think you're going to be so blessed and empowered as a result of that. So welcome, Dr. Chaison. Welcome to iLead Podcast.
It's good to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Dudley.
Is that all you got to say?
What an honor it is to be here.
Oh, I didn't want to ask you for all of that. Oh my God, I wasn't trying to ask for all of that. I just thought you were gonna. Well, this is gonna be great, guys. Let me just jump right into it. What is emotional intelligence, and how does it help you get and maintain leadership positions? Wherever you are, nonprofit, for profit, in a faith-based situation, wherever you find yourself in leadership, what can EQ do for you?
Well, emotional intelligence has a lot of sort of components to it. If you were to sort of look it up in the research, there are different ways that you might describe it. I think kind of the most succinct or simple way to describe emotional intelligence is to look at maybe two components. Part of emotional intelligence is one's awareness of emotions, one's ability to identify emotions. So there's that component. And then there's the second component, which really refers to how one responds to emotions when they come up. So those are kind of two pieces, I think, that
aware and respond.
Exactly, aware and respond. And then we can look at it even further in emotional intelligence in terms of the personal side of emotional intelligence and the relationship or the social side of emotional intelligence. So with the personal side, it's the awareness of one's own emotions, one's own reactions and experiences. And then there's that self-regulation, the way that you sort of regulate your own behaviors when you're experiencing different
Put a pin right there.
Yes, sir.
Put a pin right there, because unpack that. What I hear so often, I work with another company, Simply Success Institute, and we're always trying to help people in workforce development understand what it means to regulate. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to emotions and emotion regulation in particular, we often think about sort of the more negative sides of emotions. So things like anger, irritability, frustration, sadness, depression, anxiety, those kinds of emotions that are often maybe associated with impulsive reactions or fight or flight reactions. So when it comes to emotion regulation, it's important for us to identify what we're actually feeling at the moment. Oftentimes, I think personally, we go through life when we're just thinking, feeling, doing, but we're not necessarily paying attention to what's going on in our own bodies physiologically, which gives us a cue to our emotions, nor are we really sort of paying attention to our emotional reactions to things that are going on in our day-to-day lives or even our conversations. So part of the emotion regulation is to identify the emotions we're experiencing at any given point in time. Then the regulation part is identifying how you want to respond to those emotions in a way that ends up sort of being more helpful, more effective, and does less damage. When we are sort of inundated with these negative emotions, I like the term in emotional intelligence literature about emotional hijacking. When we get so swept up or hijacked by these negative or not so helpful emotions per se, we end up doing things that we may regret later. And so one of the hallmarks of an emotional hijacking is you've let your emotions run wild. You've said things, you've done things that then after the moment has passed, you're experiencing regret for your responses, but then also you may have done damage in relationships or damage to yourself when emotionally hijacked. So the regulation piece has you take a moment to recognize when you're sort of becoming overwhelmed by these emotions and then employ strategies to manage those emotions so that they don't hijack you, carry you away. When you apply intelligence to emotions, that's sort of what Daniel Goleman says. When you apply intelligence to emotions, you can choose your responses better. So that's the regulation piece. You can choose.
I like that when you say you apply intelligence to your emotions. I want to remind our listeners as you're listening to Dr. Chaison, she is a licensed psychologist in Texas as well as in Kansas and a National Register of Health Service Psychologists. So I say that because we have people sharing their good opinions, but they're not always grounded in an understanding of the discipline. Right. And so I want my listeners to know that the person that is sharing with you has a good handle. This is her area, and we can take it to the bank. Yes, sir. We can take it to the bank. So when we talk about this, how do I get? Okay, you want me to not let my emotions hijack my situation. I need to kind of self-regulate, but I don't even know what my EQ is. How do I get a sense of my EQ, and what is an EQ?
Well, emotional intelligence can be measured in a variety of ways, and so I think the most cost-effective way to learn about emotional intelligence and learn perhaps your proclivities is to take an online exam. There are many of them that are free. I'm not vouching for their validity or anything like that, but I certainly think it's a really good place to start so that you can kind of gauge where you are, whether it's the personal side of EQ or the social side of EQ, emotional intelligence or emotional intelligence quotient. One resource that I particularly like is Bradbury and Greaves' Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book. It's very short, very practical book. You can find it relatively reasonably priced, I think. If you purchase that book, then you have access to their version of emotional intelligence appraisal. Yes, sir. That's it. Yes, sir. I love it. I love the practicality of that book. There are other books that I think Daniel Goleman's book is really good as well. It has a lot more science and that sort of thing, but the 2.0 book is very practical. And so if you get that book, you have access to their emotional intelligence appraisal. You can complete that. It'll give you results, and it'll also give you practical skills that you can use or employ in the areas of emotional intelligence where you maybe need to strengthen things up.
You talked about, and I love this, adding adding intelligence to your emotions. You got to think, well, then it's my emotions without intelligence. I mean, you
Right.
got to think of that. I mean, that's just where your mind goes. Is my my emotions, from anger to love to sadness to joy, they really aren't. They're not attached to any kind of intellect. But when you add that, then you have some sense of regulation.
Right.
When you get that, how do you improve? You can
When you,
improve on your IQ. You can improve on taking a standardized test, your SAT, your ACT. You can improve on so many things.
right.
How do you improve and increase your EQ?
I think one is learning what it is and doing the assessments exactly as you said. I think two is beginning to employ some of the practices that you learn in different resources. So as you employ them, you start looking at the results that you're getting. So I think life experience is a big teacher, and I often use that in my work with clients. Let's just stop and take a look at what life is producing for you right now. Let's stop and see what your behaviors are producing right now. And so if they are not producing what you want them to produce, you're not getting the outcomes that you want, then that is an indication that there's an area that you may want to do some work on. So figuring out what those areas are based on your life experiences and what's working and not working. That's one way to kind of learn and improve, in addition to obviously taking assessments. I think another way that you can learn and improve is if you go through counseling. So there may be certain behavioral styles or patterns, particularly when it comes to the interpersonal realm of life. So with the interpersonal or relationship side of emotional intelligence, it involves understanding the emotions of other people, recognizing those emotions when they come up. And then the second part of that is learning how to manage your relationships in light of the emotions that are coming up for other people who are interacting with you. So when you are finding that you're having trouble in your relationships, for example, or you're having trouble in moving forward in life, you can go to counseling, and then the therapist can help you identify areas where you may want to grow in order to help get you to where you want to be and get the outcomes that you want. So I think counseling can be an effective way of learning emotional intelligence skills. For example, with emotion regulation in particular, I often use a type of therapy called problem-solving therapy, which has several toolkits for how to manage different components of life, whether it's feeling overloaded in your brain or feeling emotionally overwhelmed. When I see clients who are having trouble managing their emotions, then I teach them different skills to manage those emotions. So relaxation skills, different coping skills. So as I'm teaching them those skills to manage themselves and interact in a more helpful or effective way in their relationships, they're learning emotional intelligence. It all goes hand in hand. The other way that I think you can learn is through mentoring. So observing somebody that you admire who's getting the outcomes and producing the outcomes that you want for your life, observe them, see how they go about it. And if you are able to connect with them, they can provide mentoring as yet another way. And these are, relatively, I think, straightforward, easy ways to start working on emotional intelligence.
Okay, I'm in my corporate world. I'm in my cubicle. I am in leadership at the church. I work in this nonprofit. I'm in my own family unit. I'm a leader in all of these areas, or just some of these areas. I'm learning this. I'm working through this. I'm having impact, influence, and I'm getting outcomes. How differently will that be for one community over against another community, Black and brown
Mhm.
over against European Americans, what would that look like? Is there a difference in that?
Good question, Dr. Dudley. There is a difference. One of the things I like about emotional intelligence is the principles are broad and more universal. The application definitely has an element of culture. And so what looks like emotional intelligence, perhaps in Black and brown communities, doesn't necessarily look the same way in white communities who have more of a Eurocentric approach to what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate. So depending on the cultural norms that you're in, again, Black and brown communities or white communities or ministry or corporate America, they all have their own sets of culture that determines, again, sort of what's right, wrong, effective, and how you move people. So then I think you have to be mindful with your emotional intelligence approach to make sure it sort of fits within the culture that you're working in. So let me just give an example here, listeners. In ministry, for example, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to pay people, right? We rely on volunteers, or those who maybe rendering a service, maybe for minimal pay, but it's not an enterprise where you're paying everybody to carry on these different services or to do these different activities. And so emotional intelligence in that way, or in those contexts, really requires you to manage yourself, your communication style, because people don't have to do anything that they don't want to do. And so how you communicate with them is important, how you phrase things, your willingness to take certain things. So in ministry, you may not have a whole bunch of volunteers lining up. You may have one or two people who are willing to do X, Y, Z, but they may kind of rub you a little bit the wrong way. But this is what you got to work with. And
this is what you got to work with, baby.
This is it right here. And so as a leader, if you want to get the job done, which leadership pretty much is, then you're going to have to tweak the way you have conversations in a volunteer organization that may be different in corporate America, where you have different incentives, for example, paychecks or bonuses or things like that's different. So that's sort of what I mean as an example of the context that you use or the context that you're employing emotional intelligence. When it comes to race, I think, most people are probably aware of playing the game, right? There's a certain way you behave and respond and communicate when you're with white people, particularly in an employment context or whatever kind of context. And there are certain norms of behaviors that you engage in. Then when you get into communities of color, for example, the values may be different, not wrong, not less than, but the values may be different. Take communication, for example. With people of color, communication often involves intonation. It often involves really sort of expressive kinds of communications and nonverbals. It may involve use of slang terms that you can use, and that works in that environment. But if you go into a completely different cultural environment, they don't see things, or they may not communicate in the same way. So essentially, I think the environment that you're in can also help impact and sort of shape the way you go about practicing emotional intelligence. The other thing I'll say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I recall 100 years ago when I was in undergrad, how we were talking and I learned, and maybe it wasn't undergrad, maybe it was some masters that I was working on, that minorities, no matter the minority, but minorities always have to have 2 languages.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Like code switching.
Yes, yes. Because it was critical that they be able to function in both worlds if they were going to be successful. And so what I hear you say is that emotional intelligence and your EQ is kind of enveloped in that as well.
Most assuredly. Yes, the communication style, code switching. I'll tell you a funny story, Dr. Dudley.
Code switching.
Code switching, yes.
But tell me the story. I just wanted to make sure that our listeners got that whole word, code switching.
Thank you. Yes. So I didn't learn about the term until I got to college, and I took a course on African American studies. Then I learned kind of what the term was, but I was exposed to different ways of communicating well before then. I primarily attended a white school in junior high and high school, and I primarily went to an African American Baptist church. So those kind of were my two worlds that I grew up in simultaneously. And I learned how to communicate in these primarily white schools, and the slang, the tone. I learned, how you sound, right? That was very different than how people sounded at my church. And so I remember I was in band, and we were at band practice, and I was a section leader in high school. And one of my peers came up to me, white peers, he came up to me and he said, Angelique, he called my name. I didn't see him because my back was towards him, but he came up to me and he called my name. Before he called me, I was talking to one of my friends of color. I don't remember exact details, but I was, talking using more slang and ebonics, and shortening the verbs, and, subject verb agreement didn't have to match. And so, I was having a conversation, very comfortable with that. When he came behind me, called my name, I instantly said, yes, may I help you? Didn't even think about, it was a very different sound and approach to communication. It was just automatic. It becomes kind of part of how you operate, as you said, in these different worlds. You have to know the different ways of communicating if you're going to be able to have increased access to resources that are controlled or dominated by majority culture. So you got to know how to play the game. But that example stood out to me because I didn't even realize I was doing it. All I had to do was hear a voice, call my name, and immediately switch.
You mean you didn't say, what's up?
Not at all. It's like, yes, may I help you?
Yo, dog, why you interrupting me? Why you all in my conversation?
Right. Right. So that struck me. And I still do it today. I think in communities of color, there's kind of this challenge as well, because if you shift the way that you talk to play the game, to increase your opportunities for access, then there can come a criticism that you are talking white or acting white, or Oreo and all these other kind of pejorative terms, which I have experienced in life. So you can get that from your own community, which can be difficult to experience, and you sort of have to find your own journey and your sense of identity and your ownership of your race and ethnicity. In this case, ownership of my Blackness and what that means. And that there's lots of different racial identity models that kind of describe how you sort of travel through your own sense of identity and become comfortable with it, where you can embrace an integrated approach, where you don't just have to be so ethnic to the exclusion of everything else. You can embrace your own ethnic identity and be able to sort of acknowledge other components of your identity that are helpful for you in navigating this very diverse world that we live in.
It's called having emotional intelligence, is really what it's called.
Yes, sir.
And here's the deal. That works in all communities. Coming up as an African-American chaplain in the Air Force, having to both minister in the majority African-American service, chapel service, and then having to then also been adept at ministering in what we would call the shared faith, or the traditional service, which was predominantly white, and filled with commanders who held your career in their hands. I was charged to be able to navigate both these worlds where my white counterpart was not.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes,
I
sir.
was required to be able to navigate both those worlds
Right.
successfully,
Mm-hmm.
which in my view made me far more formidable leader
Yes,
than
sir.
my white counterpart, but not given that kind of credit.
Mm-hmm.
Am I making any
Yes, sir.
sense?
Complete sense. Yes,
And
sir.
that's really what I think we miss with respect to the ability for, whether it's the corporate world, whether it's the nonprofit world, the faith world, where we overlook many times the leadership ability
Mm-hmm.
of African Americans or minorities, because we have to be fully adept
Right.
in both worlds,
Right.
but yet hold on to our authenticity, which I always had to deal with. I had to deal with it when I went over to do the service at the African American service. Then I'm a sellout
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
because you don't sound like this. So of course
Mm-hmm.
I sound like I needed to sound,
Mm-hmm.
and what have you. And you do, either you will come to know yourself or lose yourself.
Yes, sir. Completely. And I've seen it go so many different directions that it ends up doing its own sort of psychological damage to the person who's trying to navigate their own humanity, which should be equal to everybody else's humanity, but it's not regarded that way in this society, particularly around issues of race, for sure. And we're having these conversations now more and more about race. Definitely sort of we were catapulted into these conversations with the murder of George Floyd, and then subsequent murders, which in the African American community we're fully aware of how those things sort of play out with police brutality and things like that. But the conversation came sort of center stage where these conversations are happening more than they ever have in various fields and various sort of corporations. And so I think that we're at a really great time in our history to begin having these conversations and helping our white counterparts kind of understand the world that they live in, that their eyes may have been blinded to, but they were opened by clear, obvious, racial discrimination to the point of death. And so now I think more than any time in history of my lifetime, we're at a place where we can have these conversations. And I feel very charged and inspired to have these conversations, particularly with my white counterparts who are asking now what can they do? What needs to be different?
Having these conversations because of being a psychologist in that community, the conversations are a little easier had.
Mm-hmm.
We are in a tribal, very divided
For sure.
country at this moment.
For sure.
What advice would you give to the leader, the Black or brown leader,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise minority leader, and having to move through the ladder upward in this kind of a world when they don't have the freedom of these conversations?
Right. I do think that I do want to say that the conversations in psychology aren't necessarily as easy because there's been lots of discrimination and lots of oppression, lots of disempowerment that has happened in psychology, psychiatry, mental health, physical health. And so we see most recently apologies rendered by like the American Psychological Association for perpetuating oppression, for perpetuating discrimination. We see these conversations beginning to appear, but there's still also resistance. So I don't know that it's necessarily easier to have these conversations. I think there are more people who may be willing to start to have the conversation because they can finally see that something's not right here. But again, I don't think it's necessarily easier. And that's kind of where my role is. That's actually one of the roles that I hold, both locally and nationally, is how to move people in mental health to begin having these conversations, because there's still quite a bit of resistance. I think even in corporate America, it strikes me, Dr. Dudley, as I was sort of doing my own research and preparing for a presentation, I think towards the end of last year, that corporations are beginning to have these conversations. I've got several friends who are in corporate America, who also are caught in this wave of DEI. It's a movement now, it's a wave. And so these conversations are beginning to happen in corporate America, as well as education and government. So it's happening in different places. What I think is the challenge that you sort of alluded to is that the burden of these conversations are placed on people of color. They're placed on the marginalized communities. And so, having to be the voice of African Americans or Asian Americans or Latinx Americans, that's a psychological and emotional burden placed on people who are part of marginalized communities, and not to mention Native and Indigenous populations as well. So there's that piece that makes it a bit difficult when people are turning to them and asking, what should I do? I've seen kind of this move and this push towards self-education. And so creating space and providing resources for majority culture to learn on their own and not have to rely on people of color to sort of bear this burden alone. So I think there's that can be done in different environments, in different rooms, in different spheres, is to ride the wave of DEI while it's still very popular and companies are at least doing lip service. I don't know what's happening, within the company, but at least giving some lip service. You can see that, Dr. Dudley, even in the entertainment world. You can see it in terms of the diversity of people in commercials now, in terms of different sort of movies or shows. You see it kind of popping up in pop culture. So it's all around us, I think. At least that's my position. So then a person of color can ride that wave. Again, provide resource to start the conversation, maybe offer some resources, offer kind of a perspective about this is the wave of the future. Go ahead.
But what I was gonna say, okay, I get that, and I agree that DEI is a wave, but it is lapping against the shore of replacement theory, and this CRT, critical race theory of people pushing back with the straightforward information about that. So when you take all of that together, when you then look at, okay, let's go back to that leader. I'm in my cubicle, got my head down, keep my head low.
Yes, sir.
Trying to make it work. Trying to get to the next level, trying to get that raise, that bonus, that promotion. I'm stressed out.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Chaison, psychologist, please help me.
In that sense, we need to sit and validate the stressed out part, and it's for good reason. And I think creating a space for people to have this conversation rather than holding it all internally. And so you're just trying to grin and bear it and grind. I think creating spaces or developing spaces where the leader, the person that wants to advance in their company, can have these conversations about the stress that it is. The stress, how stressful it is. It's amazing what just being able to talk can do. Now you choose who you talk to, of course, but talking versus holding it all in. And you create this community where you can share, be open and transparent. And that in and of itself is powerful. The other thing I would say is to make sure you take care of yourself. I think really the concept of self-care, we throw it out very flippantly, but be able to take care of yourself. That's the emotional intelligence piece, the personal competence side. recognizing sort of what you're feeling, what your experiences are, and then determining how you want to respond to those emotions. If we ignore our emotions, then we put ourselves again in a position to be emotionally hijacked. And then when we're in that space, it's hard to make decisions that will be helpful in advancing us, potentially.
You could easily create there are times where I think that it can become trauma for you.
Mhm.
I came up, I'm a retired Air Force chaplain, 21 and a half years. And I recall many times when it was very traumatic for me to try to make the rank, and the stress of that, and the sense of that. And I recall one time going home, and my eldest brother, who's with the Lord now, thought I was trying to present myself in such a way that was above them.
Above your family or the
My brothers.
I see.
And I recall we were all talking and sharing. And he somehow or another, I don't know whether it was my tone, maybe I wasn't flowing in my ebonics. I hadn't code shift. And he flung a beer bottle at me.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Who do you think you are? And I had no idea where that came from in that moment. But in reflection, I knew that for some reason, and here again, working and the traumatic thing, and how do you manage that? I think I want to say this, and then we got one thing, and then we'll ask you the final question. Everybody answers this question, Dr. Chaison. You will not be let off the hook.
Yes, sir.
I think, we do not give those of Black and Brown communities, women that find themselves in minority situations, because we got to learn 2 languages.
Right.
We got to manage several different communities, and we got to excel in all of them. To me, that's leadership skills. If we would go to scripture, I would have a multiplicity of gifts. But a white person in a majority world would only need one gift.
Very true. That's what I've learned, or what I was taught growing up, that you have to be twice as good, at least twice as good as the white person, if you're going to get the chance of an average white person. And I think that message is still communicated in our communities. And I do the same thing for my nieces. Like, understand the reality of the world that we live in. You have to do more. You have to excel to just even be considered. And so I hear what you're saying, and it is very true that still is the case, and it's disheartening because it's inequitable. Where we live in a country that's supposed to sort of be fair and just, right, according to its sort of founding principles, but it's not that way for people in part of minority or marginalized communities. And so acknowledging kind of what that reality is, and sort of, while it's unfair, it's not just, we have to do it. We have to play the game. And then once we get to the table and we get in that position of power, then we can start to change things little by little. I think something else that's important to think about is allyship, which is not a new term, but it is certainly a growing term to identify individuals who are committed to the cause, who are in majority culture, or whatever that majority culture is. And so identifying allies who are committed to the cause and who are intentional about the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who can open doors. And so that is another another way that you can advance is identifying allies. There may be some that are in positions of power. The other thing that I would think about, Dr. Dudley, as you were talking earlier, is there are now what's called race-based stress and trauma groups and therapies. And so in times past, when we've thought of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, we often sort of associate that with like things like combat related trauma, witnessing death or serious physical injuries, or being threatened oneself, or we think about it in terms of sexual trauma. In our diagnostic and statistical manual for psychiatric diagnoses, it still has that kind of definition of trauma, where there's growing conversation and discussion around things like racial trauma and calling it what it is. And I'm really, proud to see that we have quite a few race-based stress and trauma groups that are rolling out in VA for our veterans, particularly thinking about our Vietnam combat veterans who had multiple enemies. They had the enemies, when they were fighting in combat in Vietnam, but then they also had their white counterparts who were enemies. You have all this sort of racial injustice that has happened in different components of the military. And so there is now a real sort of push for these kinds of groups, not just for veterans, but certainly for people of color in different spaces that they're in.
That is good, because now, if I understand you correctly, race-based stress and trauma diagnosis, that's awesome. I wish I would have had that when I was active duty. Mm-hmm. It would have helped tremendously. Let me mention this to our listeners and our viewers, just so that you won't think again that we're just throwing things out to throw things out, in terms of the differences and having to be better than majority culture counterpart. Sarah Palin took years to get her undergrad, mm-hmm. and was under quite a lot of attention as to the amount of time it took her to get her bachelor's. Kamala had to have her bachelor's, had to have her law degree. She had to be an elected senator. She had to do all of that. And then on top of that, they then said, you rose to the top because of, and we won't even get into what they accused her of. It's disrespectful, totally. She had to endure that. Many women have to endure that. You could not have risen to the top because of what you know and your ability. You could have only done it some other way. I just wanted to say that for our listeners and our viewers, because you do need to understand that these are fact-based conversations that we're having, not just throwing something out. But at any rate, here we are. We're at the end. I told you it was going to go fast.
It has.
But everybody that's ever been on iLead podcasts, from the Senator Durbin to the Governor Pritzker, to all of the elected officials in my state that represent me.
Wow.
And now to you. You got to answer this one question. Nobody gets off without this one question. It's the last question. Okay. Mm-hmm. How do you lead in any room you find yourself in? And for you, how do you pull your EQ in there as well?
Good one, Dr. Dudley. Yes, sir. It's interesting you asked this question, because only recently I've really kind of embraced my fullest sense of leadership. I have often asked myself, like, how do I get in these positions where I'm leading? Like, I'm not trying to get in it. I'm not asking for it. I'm not applying for it. And like, how do I get myself into these things? And it's usually that question comes up when I'm feeling overwhelmed, because I've gotten myself into so many situations where I end up leading. And I've recently kind of discovered what I do that gets me in these different positions of leadership. I think one of the things that I do is I listen. Like, I listen and I learn in any environment that I'm in. whatever people are talking about, whatever leadership is talking about, I'm listening and I'm learning about people and how do I form relationships with these people based on their expertise in different areas. So as I'm listening and I'm learning, then I'm connecting with people. I always think people have a role to play in something, and they may have a role to play in something that I end up doing and that I'm leading. And so I'm always listening, not necessarily for a specific task in mind, but I'm listening for skill sets and strengths, because I can then pull on those if I need them for a different project, to get them to come with me, to get them to follow me, because I can tap into sort of what motivates and inspires them. So I'm always listening for those things and filing them away in the back of my mind, because you never know. That's what emotional intelligence is in terms of social awareness and relationship management, is you're always thinking about the relationships that you have and the people that you meet, and you file this sort of database in your mind. So I do that. I think that then allows me to lead out in something and bring a team. I don't think you're necessarily a leader if you don't have people following you specifically. And so like, you've got to have these relationships with people for them to follow you. So that's one of the things. I listen and I learn about people. One of the other things that I've discovered that I do is, as I'm listening and I'm learning about people, I'm looking out for opportunities, but I didn't realize I was necessarily looking out for those opportunities until I started hearing myself more recently hear a problem and say, man, this is a situation that needs to be fixed. I bet I could fix it. I bet I can address it. I bet I can create something that makes this process more efficient, or that advances this cause in some way. So I'm thinking about different ways that I could solve problems. And here's the thing, it doesn't have to be a problem that someone's identified. As I'm listening and they're talking and I hear kind of maybe different areas, then an idea pops into my mind, like, this can be better in this way. And so as I think about, listen for these opportunities, and then I figure out a way that I, as well as a team of people that I feel connected to, can help advance whatever the cause is, whatever the mission is.
Dr. Chaison,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't play fair, because I think you listened to the podcast on this question, because your answer is exactly what mostly everybody said.
Really? No, I didn't cheat. I promise you. Like,
Sure you didn't. Sure you didn't.
I didn't cheat. I really do think, as a psychologist, listening and learning is what I do as part of my career. And it just sort of goes wherever I go. And I've been having to do my own internal kind of search in terms of how is it that I get in these different leadership positions and I get stressed out. I'm like, what is it that I'm doing? EQ, the personal side of emotional intelligence, is one, figure out sort of where I am, why I end up being overwhelmed, and then regulate myself so that I don't end up in these types of positions. Also, self-regulation involves knowing what makes you tick, knowing what you like, what you don't like, knowing what you gravitate to. And so as I'm doing my own self-exploration, I'm realizing kind of the things that I get excited about, and I end up leading out in those areas, particularly as it relates to inequities and injustice, discrimination. I light up when I get to have conversations about that. And so whenever these moments kind of pop up, ideas come and I pitch them. And since, people are going to be, whoever is in the room, whoever's leadership above, they want to see advancement because it looks good for them. So part of my leadership is making sure leadership above me looks good. I'm always connected to that. And if I can make them look good, then they give me the freedom and the flexibility to lead. And so that's how I've gotten a whole lot of opportunities that weren't presented to me. No one said, hey, Dr. Chaison, let me offer you this. I didn't get those opportunities like that. My colleagues did, but I didn't. Opportunities, I inadvertently created opportunities by the way that I sort of think and see and approach the world. And of course, being a believer, I believe that God has opened doors as he's trained me. And so that's the other piece of my leadership. As I try to lead according to my values, and God's way is never wrong. So the principles that he puts in scriptures, I try to govern my life and my leadership through those things as well.
Well, Dr. Chaison, you have really empowered our listeners and our viewers with your insight about EQ and how to lead and how to listen and how to make those applications. And I really appreciate it. I think if we take all of that together and understand, if I could just put an exclamation point at the end of that, no matter what your background is, no matter what your tribe or community that you're connected with, you can lead in any room when you have a good sense of your emotional intelligence over that. So thank you so very much for being a part of iLead podcast. And any final words?
Thank you, Dr. Dudley, for giving me this space. I really do appreciate it. I thank you for making this information available, particularly for people of color, people who are part of marginalized communities. We don't necessarily get easy access to this kind of information. It's not necessarily inherent always in our spaces. And so I just want to thank you and appreciate you for giving me an opportunity to share what I've learned in creating this space, because I do think anybody can lead as long as you have somebody following you, whether it's you're a parent, a minister, a pastor, leading a small group of people at your work or your church. Anybody can lead. We just need to have the resources available for people to do that. So I just want to thank you again for this opportunity.
No problem. The Lord bless you. Faith shine upon you and give you peace. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. I receive it.